Yeah, I agree with you there. Oh, we're live. Give people a minute to tune in here. Kind of an odd time of day for a stream, but I like doing these midday streams, frankly. I think it works really well. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to another stream produced by the First Tuesday Conservatives, presented by Alpha News. I'm your host, Kyle Hooten, and my guest today really needs no introduction. Of course, this is Jason Lewis on the screen next to me. Thank you so much for being here.
Kyle, thank you, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Absolutely. So in case anybody's been living under a rock, Mr. Lewis is running for U.S. Senate from Minnesota. He's been in the public eye of Minnesotans for a long, long time. He's a strong conservative, and we're very glad to have him on the show. The first question I have to ask you, sir, what do you think the odds are that Republicans take this election?
Well, I'm not going to place odds on it, but I think they're very good. Certainly the best since 1984 or 1972. And we're seeing that with the groundswell of support on the Iron Range, predominantly DFL country. Our fundraising is stronger than anything since Senator Coleman. People are really excited this time, but I think they're excited because they know the stakes. In the 1960s and even into the 72 election, when Nixon won Minnesota, you had a weather underground, you had the Black Panthers, you had the SDS, but no major party wanted anything to do with them, including Hubert Humphrey and the Democrats. Today, that radical underground known as Antifa, it's not an idea, it's a group, now has the backing of one major political party in America. So that has a tendency to focus the mind when you're running on a platform of mob rule, defunding the police, and perpetual lockdowns. The irony of fining rodeos while letting criminals go free is not lost on Minnesota.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that your opponent, Tina Smith, of course, is allied with these people. The Democratic Party is allied with Antifa. They've endorsed this progressive agenda, and they're not going to let it go. But how do you see that? How do you see that playing out in the Iron Range and up north and anywhere other than Minneapolis, St. Paul?
We will win the Iron Range, be the first statewide Republican to win the Iron Range in a number of years. We will do very well in greater Minnesota. What Tina Smith is calculating on is the Ilhan Omar vote. That's why she endorsed her. That's why when Omar said the police are rotten to the root, I condemned her. Tina Smith endorsed her. Why? She thinks all she needs is Hennepin and Ramsey County. The other 85 counties don't matter. I have never seen a candidate for statewide office in Minnesota lean into such radical positions, whether it's a post-birth abortion, which Daniel Patrick Moynihan called infanticide, whether it is basically telling minors learn to code because we're taking away your jobs. Yeah. Whether it's a Green New Deal, shutting down the economy, fining rodeos and riots in the streets. You know, Esme Murphy might think that's centrist. The rest of Minnesota doesn't.
Yeah, of course, you've been on the campaign trail outside of Hennepin and Ramsey County, and you're telling us that this narrative is not working with those individuals.
Not at all. We've spent the bulk of the last year in greater Minnesota. Now that we're ignoring the suburbs, I represented a suburban swing district. We're going to hold our own there. But somebody's got to represent the forgotten man and woman in greater Minnesota. And they had, as you know, there was a lot of angst out there anyway that all politics in Minnesota is geared towards two counties, that they feel left out. And now when they were locked down and threatened with prosecution while their business was going bankrupt, there were riots in the streets that weren't being prosecuted. So this is why we're going to outperform in greater Minnesota. And now I think the suburbs are going to come back a little bit because they're afraid that the chaos is going to come to their town.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that that's one thing the riots have really accomplished for the right is making the suburbs and the centrists realize that politics will come for them if they don't care. What I've got to ask is these lockdowns, they've been dragging on forever. They've been hurting the people of greater Minnesota in an outsized way. Once you're in office, if these lockdowns are still going on, what's your plan to end them?
Yeah, well, the first thing we're going to do is make certain that we don't have an unconstitutional federal mask mandate. My goodness, the day we have the federal government without any interstate commerce nexus have the ability to tell you what to wear. And I want to know from Tina Smith and Joe Biden, well, if you have a federal mask mandate and I don't wear my mask, what are you going to do to me? Throw me in jail? Fine me? You know, they always leave out the penalties. It's kind of an amazing thing. But look, they have hijacked a public health concern for political purposes. They have shut down the economy. They've tried to get the country on the wrong track so there can be change at the top. They have basically invaded private property rights by telling you can't have a barbecue with over 10 people. You can't go to church. You can't go to the gun range. And you certainly can't campaign, which is an idea they hatched when they knew the economy was going along. The problem we've got, Kyle, is that the mainstream media decided to go along with it and gaslight America that this is going to kill us all. 281 million infections by now, right? Oops, there's 7 million. Just a little bit outside, as Bob Euchre used to say. They have been wrong on every single prediction, and now they're wrong that it's going to kill us all. The president has proven that conclusively. He has acted like a leader, and he stood up in front of the American people and said, Americans don't cower in place. We move forward. Don't be afraid. That was a perfect message.
Yeah, gosh, what do you make of that message? Because I've been kind of keeping track of the political backlash there. And of course, the left thinks that Trump was being reckless and his, standing on the balcony was a fascistic symbol. People on the right think it was strong leadership. What are your thoughts on the way President Trump handled his own coronavirus diagnosis?
Well, here's the problem with the Republican Party in my lifetime. The path of least resistance for Republicans is to go along with the Democrat media complex. And they keep gaslighting. They keep telling you the sky is green, not blue. And pretty soon, most people go, okay, maybe it's green, even though they know it's not. They want to conform. And so it's a little bit like getting into a bidding war with big spending Democrats. You will never win it. And yet now you've got establishment Republicans saying, oh, gosh, well, this proves we've really got to double down on the virus. Dr. Fauci is right. Joe Biden's right. We can get to the right of them by just embracing the lockdown. Who are these people? Where do we get them? So the president says, no, I don't think so. This is why they elected me, because I say the right thing. And so I believe, against the advice of some in his campaign, he went on and said, no, not going to do that. This proves that I was right. This proves we don't have to be afraid. And it also proves that the therapeutics, including experimental drugs like Right to Try, the bill that I co-sponsored, will be the future and the answer to this. I think it was absolutely critical leadership at a crucial time. Barry Goldwater had the famous line, give the voters a choice, not an echo. And that's what the president has done.
You make an excellent point there that with the liberals controlling the media, a lot of conservatives realize that the only thing they have to do to qualify as a conservative is go just to the right of the liberal media narrative. And it really leaves our party kind of hamstringed. So I'm glad that we finally have a candidate who's calling that tendency out. Speaking of the president, what'd you make of the last debates?
Oh, well, I mean, it's a little bit like Nixon and Kennedy, right? Whether you watched it or whether you listened to it.
Yeah.
But on substance, it was the president creamed you. I mean, Joe Biden has no substance. No. He's not quite even certain where he is at any given moment. So how could he possibly be expected to have substance? The president's interruptions got all the media attention, even though Biden started it. The president outdid him there. So that's all the media narrative, but it's immaterial. I think that the real question is going to be what you stand for, not how you deliver the message. And we've got to make certain we keep driving home that we stand for freedom and prosperity and economic growth and constitutional governance, whether it's Amy Coney Barrett or whether it's undoing lockdowns that have no constitutional basis, or whether it's making certain that we have peace and order and not riots in the streets. If we deliver those messages, I think we'll be just fine.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of Americans agreed with that in 2016, and I hope they continue to agree with it on November 3rd. Very similar environment if you take a look at these polls. And again, I keep repeating the word gaslighting, but I got no other description. They keep thinking if they repeat a CNN poll long enough, enough people will say, well, I'm going with the winner. It's got to be the other guy. And it is really an attempt. It's really the worst form of journalism, if you want to call it journalism. They are operating as the press office for the DNC. And there shouldn't be, if you spend a moment listening to CNN or MSNBC or any particular liberal lapdog, you've just wasted a moment. Don't do it. They're not your friends. So do you think the polls are as corrupt and as unreliable as they were in 2016?
I think more so. I think if there's a Nixonian silent majority out there in 2016, it's probably quadrupled this time. Think about it. You've got riots in the streets. You've got a media narrative out there that's deafening. And then you get a call from a stranger. You aren't going to support Donald Trump, are you? Oh, no. Then they get behind the curtain and the ballot and they vote for Trump. And I also think as well that it depends on the methodology of the poll. But again, polling for some time now has meant to create a narrative, not to reflect reality. So if you're trying to say and demoralize the right, demoralize Trump, you want a poll showing him down by double digits. If you're trying to reflect reality, why then you make certain that the sampling reflects the 2016 exit polls, not something that is lopsided towards Democrats. You do all sorts of things. So do I think it's going to be tough? Of course it's going to be tough. Do I think it's going to be close? Probably. But do I believe for one waking moment anything CNN puts out? That is the most despicable group of hacks on the earth. Why would anybody believe them?
Absolutely. You know, that's been one of the highlights of the last 3-4 years for me, is watching President Donald Trump and other figures like yourself call out CNN. It's been so refreshing to finally see these people come under the attack they deserve. But speaking
And
of,
nobody's been doing that better than Tucker Carlson, by the way.
oh, absolutely. Tucker shows.
He names names and goes after him. Long overdue.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But speaking of big tech and gaslighting and corrupt polls, this all points to this problem we have of censorship and narrative control.
Yes.
Something that I've heard a lot of rumors about lately is a potential antitrust lawsuit coming down against Google, and might even involve Facebook and other social media platforms. Where do you stand on that issue?
Well, I've never been a huge fan of a frivolous antitrust law because there's a reason companies get successful. They're delivering the product in a superior way. Why punish that, right? But what big tech got out of the 1996 Telecommunications Act was a carve out. And the carve out said, if you write an op-ed and you defame somebody, you can get sued and your publisher can get sued for publishing it. But if somebody defames President Trump on Twitter, they can't get sued and Twitter can't get sued. Now, this whole immunity from lawsuits came about because they were supposed to be a neutral platform. And therefore, we take all comers. We can't possibly be held accountable because we're going to print anything that people puts up. We're an aggregator, right? Well, surprise, surprise. They're censoring right and left. They just censored the president today because he correctly said that the flu can be more dangerous than COVID, especially for young people and school-age children. So they censored him. They put up a warning. Facebook's doing it. Twitter's doing it. Google's doing it. And think about this. And this is one thing that the president has taught us, and I think Republicans need to get real on this. If the Democrats insist on using big government to expand their power base, we can, turn the other cheek, and we can be good little free market conservatives like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and we can get our butts handed to us every cycle. Instead, we can say, oh, you like antitrust law, do you? Well, let's compare the market share of, say, ExxonMobil with Google and Alphabet. Let's see. Google has 96% search engine market share. Break them up. You're the ones that brought up antitrust. Break them up. Then and only then will you get liberals to rethink their interventionist strategy. You've got to use their apparatus to defeat them and hoist them on their own petard. And that comes straight from Trumpism, and I think it's long overdue.
100%. This is something that Trump and Tucker Carlson and all these other figures advocate, is fighting with the same tools that the left is fighting with. And you bring up a very important point here about publisher versus platform that I feel like a lot of conservatives don't understand. Once Twitter or Facebook or any social media platform starts censoring the content on their website, they become a publisher. Not a platform.
That's
and
right.
They need to abide by the rules that apply to that. So
and I can hardly wait to get to the United States Senate, join hands with Josh Hawley and repeal Section 230. It'll be so much fun. And then look, these guys are not our friends, folks. Who do you think's funding Act Blue and every Democrat who's outracing Republicans by 8, 9, 10 to 1? It's Silicon Valley. A good way to look at the swamp is, who is making a lot of money off the status quo? If they're making a ton of money the way things are, they're not going to support Donald Trump. They like it as they are, and that's Silicon Valley.
And speaking of Donald Trump in this point, just 3 hours ago, Trump tweeted, quote, repeal Section 230. So you're in very good company with that there. Glad to see it. Glad to see it. Looking ahead a little bit to this vice presidential debate that we're going to be experiencing tomorrow, what are your thoughts on this? What do you expect to see? How do you think Pence is going to perform?
Oh, just keep underestimating Mike Pence. I was with the vice president in Duluth and then in Minneapolis here the last couple of weeks. And I will tell you, he's ready to go, and he's going to outperform. Kamala Harris is the most radical candidate for vice president in the nation's history, bar none.
Yeah,
she's a woman that thinks the Knights of Columbus is a terrorist organization. I kid you not. They were going to hold up Amy Coney Barrett because you belong to this rather disturbing group. Oh, really? Who's that? The Knights of Columbus. What? Are you out of your mind? Well, she is out of her mind. She thinks that we ought to take qualified immunity away from cops so they can personally be sued if they make a split-second decision in the middle of a riot. This is a radical Democrat socialist, and I think Mike Pence is going to have an absolute field day with it.
Fantastic, fantastic. I definitely look forward to it. Just before we get away from our last topic of conversation, I want to take a question from a listener here who wrote in Pat Moulton says gaslighting and disinformation are taught to students. Propaganda is real. Will you promote teaching civics in all public and private schools?
Not only will I promote it, when I was in the 115th, I supported a bill on education and workforce that told every institution of higher learning, if you have a speech code, if you're denying due process to any student, if you're denying religious liberty on campus, here's a newsflash. Your Pell Grants are over. Your title money is gone. You're not going to get a dime from the federal government. I can hardly wait to get that passed. We have a existential crisis in education in America. And it stems from the halls of academia who are made up. When I was in graduate school, it wasn't called critical race theory. It was called critical legal studies. Now, it's a distinction without a difference, but that was the precursor to it. And I was taught it in graduate school. And essentially says, it's the deconstruction of America and the Constitution, but it says, we are all bad. America was founded on a faulty premise, and America is evil and it must be overthrown. Now you're seeing Antifa in the streets. Where do they get those ideas? Well, they got them in education far too often. So, of course, we're going to reform education, and we're going to do it sooner rather than later before it's too late. The cultural liberalism of our institutions, whether it's education, whether it's the media, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's liberation theology, whether it's almost every corporate America has the spine of a jellyfish. They're the ones funding this crap. All of those people need to get their comeuppance, and I can hardly wait to start.
Fantastic. And, I'm so glad you brought up this critical race theory, because almost nobody understands that critical race theory is not diversity training. Critical race theory is not, please refrain from using slurs in the workplace, which everyone should absolutely do. Critical race theory is, like you said, teaching people that by the nature of having white skin, it's impossible for them to avoid racism, that they have this privilege. It's a really corrupt program. What do you think about the—
Well, it's racist as well, but fundamentally it says the Constitution isn't worth the paper it's written on.
Yes.
Now, the Declaration isn't worth the paper it's written on. That we were founded on the wrong concept of God-given liberty. So we know what they want to replace it with. We're seeing it in the streets right now. We're seeing it with lockdowns right now. We're seeing it with the cancel culture right now. And that is really the dangerous thing. The idea that, it started with boycotts. I was a subject of boycott on the radio. We've mentioned Tucker. He's been the subject of boycotts. What does it say about a group of people that don't even want to hear the other side? What it says is, we're demanding conformity, and you will kneel or we'll make you kneel. And sadly, corporate America, professional sports, every weak-kneed never Trumper is going along with it because they have no guts.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's so embarrassing about that is Republicans have spent so much of their political capital advocating lower taxes for these corporations, advocating a better business environment for the NBA, and they turn around and they spit in our faces. It's totally absurd.
Right.
What kind of position?
That's really, by the way, that is really a great point. We are not the party of lowering capital gains taxes for carried interest anymore. We got to get over this Mitt Romney obsession. If we just represent Wall Street and private equity funds, why we'll govern forever. No, you'll get about 5% of the vote. We're the party of the working man and woman, and to hell with these big corporations that don't give a damn about national sovereignty. They care about globalism. They care about international multinationals, and we're going to put a stop to that. We're going to put America first. We're going to put Minnesota first.
Absolutely. That's a very strong message. That's Trump's message. And would you say it's a bit more of a populist message? Or how would you qualify that type of conservatism?
Absolutely it is. But understand this. It's Lincolnesque. If you talk about America being the last best hope of freedom on earth, well, then you've got to do everything you can to promote and protect America. So that's got to come first, whether it's controlling the border, whether it's tariffs instead of taxing American producers, whether it's all of these things that puts our national sovereignty at the center of our government. And people say, well, yeah, but that impedes my right to trade with somebody in Brazil. Yeah, it does. They don't get to vote down there either. We do lots of things that protect our country, because if our country goes, all is lost.
Yeah, gosh, an absolute breath of fresh air. The right of the Chinese to inflate their currency and use slave labor and then trade with us is less important than an American's right to sovereignty. It seems so simple.
This is the beef I've had with the Journal's editorial page for some time, and a lot of other people think there's two ways to— taxes always are a misallocation of resources, even the necessary ones. In a perfect world, Kyle, we wouldn't have to have a national defense because we wouldn't have anybody threatening us.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's not true. If we didn't have a national defense, we could spend that money on new cars and nice household furniture, and we'd all be richer. But we have to do it because we have threats around the globe. So taxes always reallocate and dislocate our assets. Then the question becomes, okay, how are you going to raise the revenue? What is the best way to raise the revenue for the things you have to fund? Well, there's only two ways. You can tax foreign consumption by having reasonable tariffs, or you can tax domestic production. In the 115th Congress, we said, actually, we don't think it's a good idea to tax American companies and let Chinese companies deliver goods with no levy. And this is really the Trumpian. He's really brought the Republican Party along to these lines of thinking. Now, it's true, we relied on tariffs for the first 150 years of our country completely until the income tax. But now you've got people like the Journal saying, oh, no, any tariff is bad because it's a tax. Well, then how are you going to get the revenue on it? Oh, we're going to tax American companies. Why is that good? It's backwards.
Yeah, it's absolutely backwards. I mean, we can tax foreign money and we can tax people that are trying to, suck revenue out of America, or we can tax Americans. It's a pretty straightforward choice to me. For those of us who are just tuning in, this is Jason Lewis. He's running for U.S. Senate from Minnesota against Tina Smith. I want to now touch on a couple of environmental issues. Line 3 is something that's been talked about a lot. What are your thoughts on line 3?
It really goes to this risk aversion concept. I mean, remember Ralph Nader and the Corvair was unsafe at any speed. Therefore, we had to recall all these cars. Then it was climate change. That's going to kill us all. We can't do that. Now it's the coronavirus. The Democrats feed on making people afraid. Because if you're afraid, what do? You give up your liberty. And so everything's a war. We had a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on anything. Why? Because when you're in a war, you're afraid. And now we got the war on the virus, right? And then we got a war on climate change. Well, if you got a war on climate change, you can't have fossil fuels because climate change is going to kill us all. Well, of course, that's fundamentally faulty. We can mitigate the effects of rising temperatures in fact, there was a Yale physicist who calculated what would it cost to mitigate the effects of climate change as opposed to trying to eradicate temperature increases. And mitigation was a fraction of what it would cost. We can handle this, and technology will handle it like it handled every other challenge. But to say we're going to massively raise taxes on the American people and carbon taxes and ban the internal combustion engine in 2035 because we think we can lower the worldwide temperature by 2 degrees Celsius is the epitome of absurdity. It is living proof the Democrats have not won the war on drugs yet. They've got to be on something to believe this crap. So Enbridge Line 3 is a dilapidated pipeline that was built in the 60s, operating at 50% capacity. And it's the only way we get crude to Minnesota's largest refinery, Pine Bend, which I represented. They say no because they don't want nuclear. They don't want fossil fuels. They don't want coal. They don't want anything. It's too damn risky. Well, the biggest risk of all is bankrupting the American people. You're talking about 8,400 jobs. You're talking about $2 billion of shovel-ready private investment ready to go. And I will tell you, there's probably been no other place where I've camped out more than Beltrami County in Bemidji and Clearbrook, and they want this bill. That's why we'll win northern Minnesota.
Fantastic. It really does come down to risk mitigation, like you say. The Democrats think everything's too risky. It's too risky to go outside without a mask. It's too risky to have industry. I think it's going to be pretty risky to live in California without motor cars. I don't like that at all. Do you think
how's that working out for California? They had an environmental policy that said no coal producing electricity. So now they farmed out all their energy production, their electricity generation. So they import their electricity when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, which in some cases in California actually doesn't happen all the time. No. So when there's a heat wave, they run out because they don't have any domestic or in-state production. The problem with the heat wave is everybody else is importing it too. And you get rolling blackouts. Now, I don't know about you, but I think rolling blackouts and wildfires are pretty risky.
Yeah, I like to have the lights on and my trees not on fire, but just a personal opinion. Governor Walz seems to have signaled that he wants to import some Californian environmental policy. He's been signaling that he's interested in California car regulations. Do you think that's a realistic threat facing Minnesota?
Well, not to Minnesota ag producers. They're terrified of the California emission standards being incorporated here because guess what? They still operate their diesel tractors, their combines, their internal combustion engines to get the job done. And the California emission standards would be devastating to them, not to mention the commuter. So, yeah, of course he does, because Governor Walz will do anything the squad tells him to do. He's not his own man, if he ever was. He is a wholly owned subsidiary of Ilhan Omar, Ariana Presley, Rashida Tlaib, and who's the other one? I can't remember.
Cortez, AOC.
Oh yeah, Sandy Cortez.
Yeah.
Right. It's sad to see what's happened. It's absolutely sad.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. One more environmental question I've got. The twin mines, what is it called? Twin metals? The twin metals.
Twin metals and polymet. Yep.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of fake news flying around about twin metals, but I see some arguments on both sides. What's your take?
If you listen to the Star Tribune and some of the more radical elements in the Metro, you would say we cannot mine in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Now, there's just one problem with that argument. Twin metals is not in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Right. It's miles away. Yeah. It is in a watershed. There's a Rainy River watershed, St. Louis River watershed, and twin metals and polymet flow into that. But so do all the other mines. So does United Tech. So if you went down the road of Betty McCollum's anti-mining bill, you wouldn't just stop precious metal mining. You would stop all mining. So I've said to Tina Smith, block that in the Senate. She says no. She wants to stop all mining. I don't. I support those. And here's why. Right now, we import our titanium from abroad. Guess which country we get it from?
Probably China.
90% from China.
Yep.
Now, according to geologists, we've got either the first, second, or third largest copper nickel reserves on the Iron Range. It would be a renaissance that the range has not seen since taconite. And taconite came about because we were all through with the high yield iron ore. Now there was only low yield iron ore, and it was too expensive to get until they developed taconite. Then you had this boom. We could have a larger boom with precious metals. And ironically, the precious metals go to lithium batteries, they go to windmills, they go to all the green stuff. Right. But they would the Tina Smiths of the world would rather import that from China, where it's much less environmentally friendly, than allow Iron Rangers their way of life. They're really afraid of this. If we follow our prescription, we get the Iron Range back humming along, it stays Republican for a generation. And that's really what's behind the Democrat plans to stop it.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned your opponent, Tina Smith. You mentioned that she's been unwilling to listen to conservative ideas. How would you characterize her leadership? Is there any spirit of bipartisanism in Minnesota politics today?
Oh, goodness. I have no idea what her leadership is except absent. I don't know that she's had any bill passed in her time. I may be wrong about that, but I haven't seen it. I know that I passed the Juvenile Justice Reform Act in 2 years in Congress, which hadn't been reauthorized for 15 years. Because in fact, in that particular case, Kyle, I reached across the aisle with Representative Bobby Scott, a Virginia liberal, and we joined up and passed that bill. But Tina wouldn't reach across the aisle if it were the last Republican on earth. She's the most partisan Democrat, votes with Chuck Schumer 90% of the time, Elizabeth Warren 83% of the time. She is a partisan. That's why she's endorsing Ilhan Omar. That's why she's for not just late-term abortion, post-birth abortion. That's why she blocked COVID relief 3 times and is now pledging, before she even listens to Amy Coney Barrett, to vote no.
Yeah.
That's not exactly an open mind.
Now, in your experience on the campaign trail, do people even know who she is? Because she hasn't made anything of a splash, as you allude to.
No, I think what she's counting on is her record not getting out, and then people sort of knee-jerk voting Democrat, which has some tradition in Minnesota, right? I mean, after all, we voted for Mark Dayton.
Yeah. Embarrassing.
Right. So that's what they're counting on. But what we're finding in our internal polling is the more people learn about her, the less likely they are to support her. And that comes down to our big challenge in this race, keeping up with money. There isn't a Republican in a major race in the United States of America right now that isn't being outraised by 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1. So they are the money in politics. They've got a Rolodex in DC they can go through, and they're just going to bombard the airwaves. They're going to lock down, then bombard the airwaves with ads. And that's their strategy, simple as that. Let's hope it doesn't work, because it's a total disservice to Minnesotans. We want to debate 5 more times. She says, I'm done with debates.
So she's refusing to meet you in debate.
Yeah, we did NPR last week, which unfortunately, I hope everybody views that debate, because you can really see where she is on a number of issues. But she says, well, I'm done after NPR. Well, that's a surprise, right? I mean, NPR. You answered that question.
Yeah. Very interesting. So we've got an absent Democrat with big money who's afraid to meet her opponent in a debate. Characterizes her pretty well for me. When it comes to the elections themselves, voter fraud is something we've been hearing a lot about. What are your thoughts on voter fraud in Minnesota? How worried should we be? Do you think we're going to come out on top? What are your thoughts generally?
We're seeing a massive enthusiasm gap in greater Minnesota. So when you look at, you get outside the metro, even just outside St. Paul and Minneapolis, you see Trump signs everywhere. You see Trump Pence everywhere, Jason Lewis, you just don't see the left. Then if you juxtapose that with the primary results, when the Democrats had 500,000 turnouts and the Republicans half of that, you start to wonder, well, wait a minute. The enthusiasm gap's on their side? I'm not seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
So where did those votes come from? Well, Project Veritas has got an idea where they came from. Other people have an idea. It's not as though there hasn't been a history of these shenanigans in Minnesota. The real dirty little secret, and this shows you the lengths to which this new Democrat Party will go, is here's what they did. Now, you might remember on previous issues in the past, and this is why I believe that attorneys general in states should not be elected. They should be appointed by the governor. But what happens is you get a gubernatorial race in a given state, but there's a separate AG race. Mm-hmm. So the AG comes to believe that he or she is really the state's chief executive officer, not the governor, especially if they're from the opposing party. So what they do is they say, well, I'm the AG and my job is to enforce state law. I'm just not going to enforce the ones I don't like.
Yeah.
We saw this in California. What happened in Minnesota this cycle is Secretary of State Steve Simon, a partisan Democrat, had cut a deal with liberal groups to sue him to change election law. And then the AG, Keith Ellison, refused to defend the state on the current law. And so the consent decree becomes the law. That is a total assault on separation of powers. It takes away the legislative function of making law, and it's a real problem. So now we're going to have votes counted until November 10th. If the postmark's not on the ballot, then by November 3rd, they can presume it's good unless somebody proves it's bad. No wonder we need that ninth justice. I hate to say it, but I think this is going to end up in federal court.
Yeah, absolutely. Aside from that ninth justice, what steps do conservatives even have open to them to oppose what looks like rampant voter fraud?
Well, it's a real problem, isn't it? The way it's written, canvassing boards who would count ballots in a dispute are supposed to be by design partisan. It's a little bit like our adversarial legal system. You want someone that everybody thinks is guilty, but you still want that person to have counsel. That's our adversarial system, so that people don't say, well, you're guilty, you can't even have a lawyer because we don't think you're innocent. You don't want that. You want even the guilty to have a lawyer. Well, the same is true of these canvassing boards. We have, depending on the size of the county, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and they're going to be partisan, and they're going to go and may the best man or woman win. Well, what's happening all over the state is they're filling these canvassing boards with hacks. Well, let's not have partisans. Let's go to the county government and pick out clerks. Well, we know what that looks like, right? So that firewall is being limited. All of this just leads to challenges in federal court, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a terrifying set of options that we have before us, and a lot of people have been talking about the possibility of violence after the election. I've heard some people saying we're going to have civil war, and I've heard some people saying it's totally overblown. What are your thoughts, and how long do you think this civil unrest that we see right now could continue?
Well, I happen to have a little different view on this. I may be wrong, but I hope not. I think if the president survives, we hold the Senate, I'm your next senator, the hard left will be so demoralized. Because think of what they've done. They've destroyed the Department of Justice credibility by spying on an opponent. Mm-hmm. They are taking away or threatening to pack the Supreme Court. They've harassed members of Congress, even engaged in violence against them. And it started with resistance and indivisible groups. Everybody needs to remember, Antifa started with indivisible and the resistance. Yep. And those were supposed to be mainstream organic protests. Bull. They were harassing town halls. They were threatening people. I got death threats when I was in Congress. So that's where it started. If they still lose after all this, I don't think they rise from the ashes, which is why they're putting everything into it. And also why they're saying, if you don't vote the right way, there'll be more violence. I think that's a threat, but I don't think they'll come through. Now, most people don't believe that. They think the other way around, that if Trump wins, oh my gosh, all hell's going to break loose. I think if Biden wins, all hell's going to break loose, because then it will have all worked. The Democrat militia will have got their man. And what message does that send? Every time we need something, send out the troops. And so I think that's a much worse message and more dangerous for the country. And I happen to believe that at some point, the DOJ will, as I say, look at this as a racketeer influenced and corruption organization and apply RICO statutes and other things that stops this interstate federal conspiracy of violence. And I think that will come very, very soon.
Absolutely. Your prediction there is something we've heard echoed by some other people we've had on the show, that if Biden wins, it'll be a validation of the violence tactics. And if Trump wins, Trump will be able to shut it down. I hadn't considered that until sort of recently, but I'm starting to like that theory a little bit more. Speaking of Antifa, once you're in office, what kind of actions and efforts would you advocate against that group?
Well, look, going back to our plan about using Democrat instruments, I do think they use RICO against pro-life protesters. I think we apply that to these people, certainly. I think there ought to be a federal hate crimes expansion of definition of assaulting a police officer. That's a federal hate crime. Mm-hmm. There's a number of things we can do. And also, if they believe in sanctuary cities, that there's an autonomy there for municipal government not to coordinate with the federal agents or ICE, then fine, they can have their prerogative. I believe in local government, the concept of subsidiarity and federalism, but then the government can say, you're not going to get our funding. That's their prerogative. And so if you're going to defund the police, not one dime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm with you there. When people want to help with your campaign, if they want to give some money, give some time, learn more about your efforts, where can they check that out? How can they stay involved?
Well, far be it from me to say candidates need money, right? But candidates need money. And so that's our biggest challenge. And then go to Lewis4MN, LEWIS4MN.com. You can donate there. You can see our issue papers. You can see the latest in the news, and you can donate, as I say, at Lewis4MN. And we need your help. Thanks for everything you guys have done. But the push is on. We're this close. Yeah. Our polls show us within the margin of error, but some show us down further. So I think, to be perfectly blunt, I'd say we're probably down 2 points. Yeah. So we got to keep pushing and get across that finish line. And if we do, we're going to save the republic and save our state.
Absolutely. This is an extremely important election. What's that final push going to look like for you guys?
Well, I think we're going to hit the suburbs very hard. We have literally, I've been to almost every county in Minnesota, probably 40,000 miles. I think we've shored up the range. I think we're in good shape there. But now with this violence in the streets that nobody on the Democrat side wants to curtail, I think it does put the suburbs that traditionally, or I shouldn't say traditionally, but some people feared were trending blue. Mm-hmm. I think it allows us to go back in there and bring them home. Okay. And so we'll be doing a lot of that. But, there'll be no stone unturned.
Good. Well, we've covered a lot in the course of this interview. We've talked about environmental issues. We've talked about, universities, education. We've talked about all sorts of stuff. Is there anything you want to leave us with that we haven't had the opportunity to discuss yet?
Well, look, there's two things that are the hallmarks of civil society: public order and a rising tide of economic growth. Both of those things are on the ballot. If we lose this cycle, you will not have public order. You'll have absolute conformity until you acquiesce. And two, you certainly won't have a rising tide of economic growth if you undo the tax reform and then throw $4 trillion of taxes and regulations on top of it.
No kidding.
So every politician, Kyle, you're a young man, but every politician for decades and decades have said, this is the most important election of your lifetime.
Yeah.
Well, I got news for you, folks. This is the most important election of your lifetime. It really is. It's certainly the most important election in my lifetime. We either get it right and we defeat the hard left, or we'll wake up to a place we don't recognize.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. You're right. Everyone does say this is the most important election of our lifetime, but it seems like this is truly a cultural watershed moment that will impact the lives of every American. Again, this has been Jason Lewis. He's running for U.S. Senate from Minnesota. He's going to unseat Tina Smith on November 3rd. Go to his campaign website, go to his social media, volunteer with his campaign. They're going to be hitting the suburbs hard over the next couple of weeks. This is a very important election. Mr. Lewis, thanks so much for being with us.
Kyle, thank you, and keep up the great work you've been doing.
Thank you. One note before we shut down the stream here, we're going to be back this evening at 6:30 to talk to Dr. Bob Hamilton, a leading pediatrician, and we're going to discuss the impacts of cancel culture and coronavirus on children. So tune in then at 6:30 when we're going to be talking about coronavirus and the lockdown's impact on the youngest of America. Thanks for tuning in, guys.